Nobody helped us, my son said with a laugh, raising his wine glass while sitting inside the very house I nearly lost to keep his dream alive. The words settled over the dining room like cold dust. For a moment nobody spoke. Vanessa smiled politely beside him, her diamond bracelet catching the light from the chandelier. I used to polish myself every Christmas when Ethan was still a little boy sleeping down the hall. The dining room looked nothing like it had 12 years ago. Back then, the wallpaper had been peeling near the ceiling, the furnace rattled through every winter night, and I used to keep a bucket under the kitchen sink because the pipes leaked whenever it rained hard. Now there were marble countertops, imported chairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake. Ethan called it the reward for hard work. I sat quietly at the end of the table while his business friends nodded in admiration. They believed every word he said. Why wouldn't they? Ethan wore success well. His tailored navy blazer fit perfectly. His watch probably cost more than my first car. Vanessa leaned against his shoulder with the soft smile she saved for company dinners and charity galas. We started with absolutely nothing, she added gently, swirling the wine in her glass. Nobody gave us anything. Everything we have, we built ourselves. A few people clapped softly. One woman across from me actually looked emotional. I lowered my eyes to my plate before anyone could see the expression on my face. The roast chicken had already gone cold. I suddenly remembered another winter evening long ago, when I sat alone at this same table eating canned soup after the bank threatened foreclosure on my home. Ethan had been 30 then. Desperate. Terrified. His startup was collapsing faster than he could save it. I could still hear his voice shaking over the phone. Mom, if I lose this company, I lose everything. Back then, this house was all I had left after my husband Walter died. The mortgage was nearly paid off. Walter spent 30 years working overtime at the paper mill so we could finally own something outright before retirement. He used to stand in the backyard every spring, with dirt on his jeans and say, "One day this place will protect you when I'm gone." But Walter never imagined I would risk losing it to save our son. I remember sitting inside the bank manager's office with my hands trembling inside cheap wool gloves, because I had turned the heat off at home to save money. The manager looked at me twice before asking, "Are you absolutely certain you want to use the house as collateral?" I said yes anyway. Ethan cried when I told him the loan went through. He promised me he would never forget what I did for him. "I swear, Mom," he whispered back then, "one day I'll make this right." But people forget promises once the panic leaves their lives. Success has a strange way of rewriting history. I looked around the dining room again. Nobody here knew the truth. Not the young couple discussing vacation homes in Aspen. Not the investors laughing near the fireplace. Not even Vanessa's parents sitting proudly beside the window. To them, Ethan and Vanessa were self-made, ambitious, independent. I folded my napkin carefully onto my lap, as Ethan continued speaking about expansion plans and luxury developments. Then he smiled again and said the one thing that finally made something inside me go still. "Some people wait around for handouts," he said casually. "But I've always believed you either build your own future, or nobody will do it for you." Vanessa touched his arm affectionately. The room filled with soft laughter. And for the first time in my life, I realized my son had not forgotten what I sacrificed for him. He had simply decided it sounded better without me in the story. That night, after everyone left, I stayed behind in the kitchen pretending to organize dishes that were already clean. The house had gone quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the clock above the stove. Ethan and Vanessa had gone upstairs hours earlier, laughing about some resort in Italy they planned to visit that summer. Their voices carried faintly through the ceiling, while I stood at the sink staring out into the dark backyard. The garden lights reflected softly across the lake, calm and expensive looking, the kind of view people framed in magazines. 12 years ago there had been no lights back there. Just frozen grass, broken patio furniture, and snow piled against the old wooden fence Walter kept promising to replace before he got sick. I dried the same plate 3 times without realizing it. My hands ached more these days, especially when the weather changed. The doctor said arthritis was normal at my age, but some mornings it felt like my joints remembered every extra shift I worked after Walter died. Back then I cleaned offices at night for $14 an hour because the survivor benefits were not enough to cover the mortgage and Ethan's loan payments at the same time. Most evenings I came home after midnight with swollen feet, and the smell of industrial cleaner clinging to my coat. I used to sit at this same kitchen table balancing bills beside a single lamp because I was afraid to turn on too many lights. Every dollar mattered. I remember one January morning when the furnace stopped working completely during a snowstorm. The house dropped to 50 degrees by sunrise. I wrapped myself in 2 blankets and boiled water on the stove just to warm my hands enough to sign another check for Ethan's business loan. He never knew any of that. Or maybe he did once. Maybe people only remember sacrifices while they still need them. I opened one of the lower cabinets and found an old coffee tin pushed toward the back. For a second I forgot it was still there. Walter used to keep spare screws and nails inside it for little repairs around the house. I pulled it out slowly and the lid rattled softly in my hands. Underneath faded receipts and yellowed appliance manuals sat a folded bank notice dated February 14, 2014. Final warning before foreclosure. The paper felt thin and brittle now, but I still remembered the fear that hit me the day it arrived. I had stood right here in this kitchen reading those words while snow fell outside the window, and Ethan cried over the phone telling me payroll was due in 3 days. "If I miss payroll, everyone quits," he had said. "Mom, I just need more time." I gave him the time. I gave him the house Walter built with 30 years of overtime shifts and sore knees and missed vacations. I gave him the retirement Walter wanted me to have after he was gone. I folded the notice carefully and slipped it back into the tin when I heard footsteps coming downstairs. Vanessa appeared in the doorway wearing a silk robe and holding a glass of sparkling water with lemon. She smiled when she saw me. "You do not have to clean up, Helen," she said sweetly. "The cleaning service comes tomorrow." I nodded quietly and placed the coffee tin back into the cabinet. Her eyes flickered toward it for half a second before returning to me. "Ethan is really happy tonight," she said. "It means a lot to him that people respect what he built." I looked at her for a long moment. Her face remained calm, polished, impossible to read. Then she added softly, "Not everyone understands how hard it is to become successful without help." I felt something cold settle deep in my chest then. Not anger. Not sadness either. Something quieter. Something sharper. Because for the first time, I realized Vanessa had not simply erased me from Ethan's story. She had helped him bury me there. The next morning, I woke before sunrise the way I always did. Old habits stay long after people stop needing you. The guest bedroom Ethan and Vanessa gave me overlooked the side driveway instead of the lake. I used to tell myself it did not matter. A room was a room. But sometimes small details reveal larger truths. The master suite upstairs faced the water with tall windows and a private balcony. My room faced garbage bins and the neighbor's fence. I sat on the edge of the bed for a while listening to the silence inside the house. Expensive homes sound different in the morning. Softer somehow. The heating system hummed quietly through hidden vents. Somewhere downstairs, the automatic coffee machine clicked on by itself. Everything in Ethan's world worked without effort now. I pulled on my sweater and walked carefully downstairs, my knees stiff from the cold air conditioning they kept running at night. The kitchen looked untouched, all white marble and polished chrome glowing faintly beneath under-cabinet lighting. I remembered the old kitchen Walter built piece by piece. Over 20 years. Uneven cabinet doors. Scratched countertops. A stubborn drawer that only opened if you pulled upward first. Nothing matched back then, but every inch of that house carried our fingerprints. I started making coffee quietly when I noticed papers spread across the island countertop. At first I thought they were business reports. Ethan always brought work home now. But one line caught my eye immediately. Property restructuring options. I froze. Beneath the heading sat photographs of houses, financial summaries, and printed maps with highlighted lots near the lake. One image made my stomach tighten instantly. My house. Or at least the house it used to be before Ethan renovated everything after moving in 3 years ago. I stepped closer slowly. There were handwritten notes in Vanessa's neat cursive beside the photo. Potential teardown value extremely high. Another note below it read, "Could subdivide property after refinance." I stared at the words for several seconds before hearing footsteps upstairs. I moved back immediately just as Vanessa entered the kitchen wearing exercise clothes and carrying her phone. She stopped when she saw me near the island. For one brief moment, her expression hardened. Then the polished smile returned. You are up early, she said brightly. I lifted my coffee mug slightly. Could not sleep. She gathered the papers quickly into a leather folder without explaining them. Just boring finance stuff, she said casually. You know how Ethan is. I nodded even though she had already stopped looking at me. There was something strange about the speed with which she hid those documents. Too fast for simple business paperwork. Too careful. Ethan came downstairs a few minutes later, distracted and scrolling through emails on his phone. He kissed Vanessa on the cheek before pouring himself espresso. Big meeting today, he muttered. Bankers are already asking questions. Vanessa gave him a quick look. A silent one. The kind couples develop after years together. Ethan noticed me then and smiled politely. Morning, Mom. Mom. Not the warm version from years ago. Not the voice that once called me crying outside his first apartment because he could not pay rent. This version sounded rehearsed, efficient, like something squeezed between meetings. He glanced toward the leather folder in Vanessa's hands. Did Michael send the revised numbers? He asked quietly. Vanessa shook her head once. Not yet. Ethan rubbed his forehead. We need this closed before quarter end. Then he noticed me still standing there holding my coffee. The conversation stopped immediately. Vanessa changed the subject so quickly it almost made me laugh. Helen, are you still planning to visit your friend Carol this weekend? She asked sweetly. I looked at her carefully then. Too carefully. Because suddenly I understood something I had been missing for months. They did not want me asking questions. And whatever was happening behind those polite smiles involved far more than old family resentments. That afternoon, after Ethan and Vanessa left for their meetings, I wandered upstairs searching for a sweater I thought I had packed away months earlier. The hallway smelled faintly of expensive candles and fresh paint. Vanessa changed the decor every season now. New artwork, new rugs, new furniture delivered almost monthly. She once told a guest that homes needed to evolve with success. I remember thinking how strange it sounded coming from someone who had never known what it felt like to lose everything. I reached the end of the hallway and stopped outside the small storage room beside Ethan's office. The door stood slightly open. Inside were stacks of old boxes they never unpacked after moving into the house permanently. Most belonged to me. Walter's fishing gear. Old photo albums. Christmas decorations wrapped in newspaper from 10 years ago. Ethan kept promising to organize everything properly someday. Someday never came. I stepped inside carefully and pulled one box closer. Dust floated through the sunlight cutting across the room from a tiny square window. The first album I opened held photographs from Ethan's childhood. Little league games. School science fairs. Summer trips to Lake Michigan in Walter's rusted pickup truck. In every picture, Ethan looked happy in the uncomplicated way children do before adulthood teaches them embarrassment. I found one photo of him standing in front of this house at age 12 holding a garden hose while Walter repaired the porch railing behind him. Back then the siding still needed paint and the front steps leaned slightly to one side. But Walter looked proud anyway. He always believed a home mattered more than appearances. Beneath the album sat a thick envelope filled with old documents. Most were bank statements and insurance papers, but one folded letter stopped me cold the moment I recognized Ethan's handwriting. Mom, I do not know how to ask this without sounding pathetic. Those were the first words. I sat down slowly on an unopened moving box and kept reading. The letter was dated March 3, 2014, right in the middle of the worst period of Ethan's financial collapse. I remembered that month clearly. Collection calls every day. Investors pulling out. Ethan losing nearly 30 pounds from stress alone. In the letter he wrote about waking up every morning terrified he would fail his employees, terrified he would disappoint his father's memory. Then near the bottom, the handwriting changed slightly like his hands had been shaking. If you lose the house because of me, I will never forgive myself. I stared at that sentence for a long time. Outside the small window, clouds drifted slowly over the lake while boats cut thin white lines across the water. Ethan had once understood exactly what I was risking for him. He knew. That was the part that hurt most. Not forgetting would have been easier to forgive. But this was different. This was rewriting. I folded the letter carefully when another paper slipped from the envelope onto the floor beside my feet. A photocopy of the original collateral agreement. My name sat there beside the property description in black ink. Helen Carter. Primary residential asset secured against business stabilization loan. But another line lower down caught my attention immediately. Personal guarantee remains active until formally released by lender approval. My stomach tightened. I read the sentence again, slower this time. Active. Nobody had ever told me that. Ethan assured me years ago the debt had been resolved after the company became profitable. I suddenly remembered the papers on the kitchen island that morning. Property restructuring. Refinance. Bankers asking questions. A cold feeling moved through me then, quiet and steady like winter air creeping beneath a locked door. Because if my guarantee was still active, then this house had never truly stopped being collateral. And somewhere beneath all the polished marble and expensive renovations, the bank still owned a piece of my life. For the next 2 days I said nothing. I cooked dinner when Vanessa asked if I minded helping. I folded towels from the laundry room. I smiled politely during Ethan's phone calls about investors and expansion projects and numbers too large for ordinary people to imagine. But inside, something had shifted permanently. Once you discover people have been quietly building their future on top of your silence, you start listening differently, watching differently. I noticed how Ethan checked his phone constantly now, even during meals. I noticed Vanessa spending hours inside the office with spreadsheets spread across the desk and legal pads filled with handwritten notes. One evening I walked past the room and heard her say quietly, "If this does not go through by summer, we are exposed." Exposed. The word stayed with me long after the conversation ended. On Thursday afternoon, while Ethan and Vanessa attended another meeting downtown, I drove to the small branch bank Walter and I had used for almost 40 years. The building looked smaller than I remembered. The old teller windows had been replaced with sleek counters and digital kiosks. Even the smell was different now. Less paper. Less coffee. More polished stone and cold air conditioning. I almost turned around twice before finally walking inside. A young receptionist greeted me with the careful smile younger people reserve for older women. They assume need help printing passwords. "Can I assist you today?" she asked brightly. I tightened my grip on my purse. "I need information about an old business collateral agreement connected to my property." She typed something quickly before asking me to wait. A few minutes later, a man stepped out from a glass office near the back. Gray suit, silver hair, familiar face. It took me several seconds to recognize him. "Mrs. Carter," he said carefully. "Helen Carter?" I stared at him. "Michael Reeves." He smiled softly. Older now. Thinner. But still carrying the same calm expression I remembered from years earlier when Ethan's company nearly collapsed. Michael had worked in commercial lending back then. He was the one who processed my paperwork the day I put my house on the line for Ethan. "I heard Ethan's company became very successful," he said as he guided me into his office. I nodded once. Apparently successful enough to forget how it started. Michael's expression changed slightly at that. Not surprise exactly. More like recognition. He closed the office door quietly before sitting across from me. "What exactly are you trying to find out?" he asked. I pulled the photocopy from my purse and slid it toward him. Michael adjusted his glasses and read silently for nearly a minute. Then he leaned back slowly in his chair. "You were never formally released from the guarantee," he said carefully. The words landed harder even though part of me already knew. "Meaning what?" I asked quietly. Michael hesitated before answering. "Meaning if Ethan's refinancing fails or the company defaults under certain conditions, the property attached to the original agreement could still be vulnerable." Vulnerable. Such a polite word for losing your home. I stared out through the office window toward the parking lot where rain had started falling in thin gray sheets. "He told me it was over years ago," I whispered. Michael looked uncomfortable now. "Helen, there are things I probably should not discuss directly." That was when I knew there was more. Much more. He lowered his voice slightly. "Ethan's company has expanded very aggressively these last few years. New developments. New loans. A lot of leverage." I folded my hands together to stop them trembling. "And Vanessa?" Michael looked at me carefully then. "She has been heavily involved in the financial restructuring meetings." Neither of us spoke for several seconds after that. Finally, Michael opened a drawer beside his desk and removed a thin folder. I should not even still have copies of these, he admitted quietly. Inside were emails, loan extensions, old financial statements. Then one page near the bottom stopped me cold. Subject line, Emergency Stabilization Strategy. Attached collateral source, Helen Carter Residential Property. Current guarantor status, active. I looked up slowly. Michael's face remained calm, but his eyes carried something close to pity. Helen, he said softly, your son's empire is still standing on your name. When I returned to the house that evening, the lights along the driveway were already glowing against the darkening sky. Rainwater shimmered across the stone path leading to the front door. And for a moment I simply sat inside my car with the engine off, listening to the soft tapping of rain against the windshield. My hands rested quietly on the steering wheel, while Michael's words repeated themselves over and over in my mind. Your son's empire is still standing on your name. I had spent years believing my sacrifice belonged safely in the past. Something painful, yes, but finished. Instead, it had been quietly following me all this time like a shadow no one mentioned out loud. Inside the house, Vanessa stood in the kitchen arranging flowers in a tall crystal vase. White lilies. Expensive ones. The sharp floral scent filled the room immediately. She looked up when I entered and smiled warmly. Too warmly. There you are, she said. We were starting to wonder if you got caught in traffic. Not worried. Just tracking me. Ethan appeared moments later carrying his laptop bag and loosening his tie. Mom, he said casually. How was your afternoon? I removed my coat slowly and hung it by the door. Quiet, I answered. Ethan nodded distractedly before opening the refrigerator and pulling out bottled water. He looked exhausted beneath the polished surface he worked so hard to maintain. His eyes carried faint shadows now. His shoulders remained tense even standing still. Pressure leaves fingerprints on people whether they admit it or not. Vanessa stepped closer beside him. We were actually hoping to talk with you tonight, she said gently. There it was. I felt strangely calm the moment she said it. Like hearing a storm arrive after watching dark clouds gather all day. Ethan glanced toward her briefly before speaking. Nothing serious, he added quickly. Just some paperwork stuff connected to the property. Property. Not home. Not family. Property. I nodded once as though none of it surprised me anymore. All right. Dinner that evening felt carefully staged. Vanessa cooked salmon with roasted vegetables and opened a bottle of wine expensive enough to make Walter laugh himself sick if he were still alive. Ethan kept trying to sound relaxed, but his knee bounced beneath the table the entire meal. Every few minutes Vanessa would touch his wrist lightly as though calming him without words. I noticed everything now. The pauses. The glances. The rehearsed smiles. People reveal themselves most clearly when they need something. Halfway through dinner, Vanessa finally set her fork down and folded her hands neatly together. Helen, she began softly, you know how much Ethan values family. I almost smiled at that sentence. Not because it was funny, because it sounded practiced. Ethan leaned forward slightly. The company is restructuring some assets temporarily, he explained. It is honestly just financial strategy. Completely normal. I sipped my water quietly without interrupting him. Vanessa slid a thin folder across the table toward me. Cream-colored paper. Gold-embossed lettering from some legal firm downtown. There are a few signatures needed, she said carefully. Mostly procedural updates tied to refinancing. I rested my fingertips lightly against the folder without opening it. Ethan rushed to continue speaking. It actually protects everything long-term, Mom. Better rates. Better liquidity. It is smart business. Smart business. I thought about the foreclosure notice hidden inside Walter's old coffee tin upstairs. I thought about winter nights spent sleeping in coats because I could not afford heating oil after saving Ethan's company the first time. Then I looked at my son sitting across from me in a custom-tailored suit asking me to risk everything again while pretending nobody had ever helped him. Vanessa pushed a pen gently toward my side of the table. There is no pressure, she said with that smooth, polished voice of hers. We just thought it would be easiest while everyone is together. I looked down at the folder but did not touch the pen. Something inside me had finally stopped bending. Quietly. Completely. And for the first time in many years, I realized I no longer felt afraid of disappointing my son. I left the folder unopened beside my plate while the three of us sat in silence. Somewhere beyond the windows, rain continued falling softly across the lake, turning the water dark and glassy beneath the outdoor lights. Ethan finally cleared his throat and forced a small smile. "It really is routine, Mom," he said. "You are not taking on anything new." I looked at him carefully then. Really looked at him. The faint lines near his eyes. The nervous tension in his jaw. The expensive watch on his wrist that probably cost more than Walter earned in several months at the paper mill. Success had changed Ethan's life completely, but underneath all the polished confidence, I suddenly saw the same frightened young man who once sat at my kitchen table begging me to save him. The difference now was that fear had made him selfish. "What exactly happens if I do not sign?" I asked quietly. Ethan's expression froze for half a second before Vanessa answered instead. "Helen, it is simply a temporary adjustment tied to liquidity structure. People hide ugly truths inside elegant words. Liquidity structure. Temporary adjustment." They sounded cleaner than risk. Cleaner than foreclosure. Ethan leaned forward again. "Look, Mom, there is pressure from the lenders right now because of expansion costs. This just helps stabilize things until a few projects close." I rested my hands in my lap. "And if those projects do not close?" Ethan exhaled sharply. Vanessa stepped in immediately with that polished calm voice she always used when trying to control a conversation. There is no reason to think negatively. But I noticed she still had not answered the question. Ethan reached for the folder and opened it himself, flipping pages too quickly for me to read properly. "It is mostly technical language," he said. "The lawyers already reviewed everything. Lawyers, bankers, advisors, everyone reviewing papers connected to my life except me." I looked down at the signature line waiting near the bottom page. Helen Carter. The same signature they needed 12 years earlier when Ethan's first company nearly collapsed. Back then he cried while asking for my help. Tonight he looked irritated that I had not signed immediately. That difference mattered more than either of them understood. I pushed the folder gently back across the table. "I will need time to review this." Vanessa blinked once. Just once. But it was enough. "Of course," she said smoothly. "Although timing is somewhat important." Ethan rubbed his forehead again. "Mom, honestly, there is not much to review." I met his eyes steadily. "Then you should not mind waiting." The room went very still after that. I could almost feel the shift beneath the surface politeness. Ethan leaned back in his chair slowly, disappointment hardening into frustration across his face. Vanessa folded her napkin with careful precision before standing to clear dishes that were barely touched. Neither of them spoke for nearly a minute. Finally Ethan gave a short laugh without humor. "You know," he muttered quietly, "sometimes I feel like nobody understands the pressure I am under." Nobody. That word again. Always nobody. As though success had appeared from thin air. As though no one had frozen through winters beside unpaid heating bills to protect his future. I stood slowly from the table and picked up the folder. "I understand pressure better than you think," I said calmly. Ethan looked up at me, then really looked at me for the first time in years. Something uncertain flickered across his face. Guilt maybe. Or fear. Vanessa interrupted before the silence could settle too deeply. "We should all get some rest," she said quickly. "Tomorrow is going to be busy." I nodded once and carried the folder upstairs to the guest room. After closing the door behind me, I sat quietly at the small desk beside the window and opened the papers properly for the first time. The language was dense and cold and careful. But one sentence near the middle made my stomach tighten instantly. Additional guarantor protections waived upon execution. Waived. My protections. Gone with one signature. I stared at the line for a long time while rain streaked softly down the window beside me. Then I reached into my purse and removed the old letter Ethan wrote 12 years earlier. "If you lose the house because of me, I will never forgive myself." I placed the letter beside the contract and suddenly understood something heartbreaking. My son had not become cruel all at once. It had happened slowly. One compromise at a time. One lie at a time. Until eventually he could sit across from his own mother and ask her to risk everything again without even calling it sacrifice. The next morning, the house felt strangely careful around me. That was the only way I could describe it. Careful. Vanessa moved through the kitchen speaking softer than usual. Ethan avoided eye contact during breakfast and spent most of the meal staring into his phone while untouched toast cooled beside his coffee. Neither of them mentioned the documents from the night before. But silence can say more than arguments ever do. Around 10 o'clock, Ethan left for another meeting downtown. Vanessa followed shortly after, dressed in cream-colored slacks and carrying 2 phones and a leather binder against her chest like armor. Before leaving, she paused near the front door and smiled politely. "Take your time reviewing everything," she said. "We all want what is best for the family." The family. Funny how people use that word most often when money is involved. After they drove away, I returned upstairs carrying the folder and Ethan's old letter. The guest room suddenly felt too small, too temporary. I opened the curtains and stared across the lake while sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time in days. Boats drifted quietly over the water. Somewhere nearby, children laughed from a neighboring dock. Ordinary life continued while my own seemed to be quietly unraveling beneath polished surfaces and legal language. I sat down slowly at the desk and began reading every page carefully this time. Not as a mother trusting her son. As a woman protecting herself. The farther I read, the colder I became. The refinancing agreement did not simply extend existing obligations. It expanded them. Increased exposure. Additional leverage against property assets tied to prior guarantees. My guarantee. My house. Walter's house. Near the bottom sat another clause highlighted in yellow. In the event of restructuring failure, guarantor waives right to prior asset protections. I read the sentence 3 times before understanding what it really meant. If Ethan's expansion collapsed, they could come after everything attached to my name. Again. My chest tightened slightly, but not from panic this time. Clarity can feel a lot like grief. Around noon, I heard a car pull into the driveway. A moment later, the doorbell rang downstairs. I almost ignored it until I glanced through the upstairs window and recognized Michael Reeves standing near the front steps holding a thin envelope beneath his coat. I opened the door carefully. Michael looked uncomfortable being there. "I apologize for stopping by unannounced," he said quietly. "But after our conversation yesterday, I thought you should have this." He handed me the envelope. Inside were photocopies of internal lender summaries and projected risk assessments tied to Ethan's latest developments. Large red numbers marked several pages. Deferred obligations. Overleveraged positions. Pending liquidity concerns. I looked up slowly. Michael kept his voice low. "The bank is worried, Helen. More worried than Ethan is admitting." My fingers tightened around the papers. "Does Ethan know how serious it is?" Michael hesitated. "I think Ethan believes one final expansion deal will solve everything." "And Vanessa?" Michael looked away briefly toward the lake. "Vanessa is pushing aggressively for refinancing approvals, including anything connected to collateral security." He did not need to explain further. We both understood exactly what that meant. I invited him inside for coffee, but he declined politely. Before leaving, he paused beside the door and looked at me carefully. "You know," he said softly, "most parents would still sign after everything." I stared past him toward the long driveway Ethan once rode his bicycle down as a little boy. "Maybe," I answered quietly, "but most parents are not asked to disappear from their own story first." After Michael left, I stood alone in the silent house holding the papers against my chest. Then slowly, for the first time since all this began, I walked downstairs into Ethan's office. The room smelled faintly of leather and expensive cologne. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined the walls beside framed magazine covers praising Ethan's success. Self-made entrepreneur. Visionary developer. Rising industry leader. I looked at those words for a long time before opening the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside sat dozens of neatly organized files. Financial reports. Loan schedules. Property projections. Then near the back, beneath a stack of contracts, I found a folder labeled simply, Guarantor Strategy. And underneath it, written in Vanessa's handwriting, were 4 words that made the entire room feel cold around me. Keep Helen cooperative. That evening, Ethan invited several investors to the house for what Vanessa called an intimate strategy dinner. Caterers arrived before sunset carrying silver trays and crystal glasses, while soft jazz drifted through hidden speakers in the ceiling. The dining room glowed warmly beneath chandeliers Walter once insisted were too expensive for ordinary people like us. I remembered laughing at him back then, telling him ordinary people deserved beautiful things too. Funny how beauty changes once you understand what it cost. Vanessa moved through the house greeting guests in a cream-colored dress with the effortless confidence of someone who believed she controlled every room she entered. Ethan looked tense beneath his practiced smile, but the investors either did not notice or pretended not to. Money attracts performance almost as much as success. I stayed mostly quiet during dinner, listening while Ethan described future projects with polished certainty. Luxury waterfront developments, commercial expansions, new financing opportunities. Everyone around the table nodded approvingly, while expensive wine flowed freely into crystal glasses. Then one investor asked the question that shifted the entire evening. "So how did you pull through those early years?" he asked with genuine curiosity. Ethan smiled automatically. "Honestly, we built everything ourselves." Vanessa touched his arm proudly. "Nobody handed us anything." The room filled with soft admiration again. But this time something inside me no longer felt wounded, only clear. I set down my fork carefully and reached beside my chair where I had placed a small leather folder earlier that evening. Ethan noticed it immediately. So did Vanessa. I saw both their expressions tighten at the exact same moment. "Actually," I said quietly, "that is not entirely true." The room went still. Ethan gave a strained laugh. "Mom, not tonight." But I opened the folder anyway. Slowly, calmly. Inside sat copies of everything. The foreclosure notice, the original collateral agreement, Ethan's handwritten letter from 12 years earlier, the lender summaries Michael gave me, and finally, the page labeled guarantor strategy with Vanessa's neat handwriting beneath it. "Keep Helen cooperative." One of the investors frowned slightly as I placed the papers onto the tablecloth beside the wine glasses and candles. Nobody spoke. Even the music from the ceiling suddenly seemed too loud. I picked up Ethan's old letter first. The paper trembled slightly in my hands, not from fear but age. "My son wrote this to me the winter his company nearly collapsed," I said softly. Then I read the line aloud. "If you lose the house because of me, I will never forgive myself." Ethan's face lost color immediately. Vanessa sat perfectly still beside him. I placed the letter down gently and slid the collateral agreement across the table. "This house," I continued calmly, "was used to save Ethan's business when the banks refused to help him. Walter and I nearly lost everything protecting his future." One investor quietly removed his glasses and stared down at the documents. Another looked directly at Ethan with a completely different expression now. Not admiration. Calculation. I lifted the final page slowly. The one from Ethan's office drawer. "And apparently," I said, my voice steady as glass, "they recently decided risking my home again would be easier if I stayed cooperative." Vanessa finally spoke then. "Helen, this is inappropriate." I looked at her carefully. "No," I answered quietly. What was inappropriate was rewriting history, while asking me to sign away my life again. Ethan stood abruptly from his chair. "Mom, enough." But his voice cracked halfway through the sentence. Not anger. Panic. Real panic. The kind I recognized instantly because I had once spent years carrying it for him. I gathered the papers calmly back into the folder while nobody at the table moved. Outside, the lake reflected the dark evening sky and long black ripples beneath the windows. Finally, I looked directly at Ethan one last time. "You spent years pretending nobody helped you," I said softly. "So now you can finally find out what that feels like." Then I stood, carried the folder beneath my arm, and walked out of the dining room while the silence behind me followed like a closing door.